Story 1. The Christmas Eve. Freezer. The thermometer read exactly 32 degrees Fahrenheit when I pulled back the industrial freezer door at St. Michael's Hospital on December 26, 2011. Inside, beneath a stack of frozen plasma bags deliberately placed to obscure the view, lay the body of a 34-year-old respiratory therapist named Amanda Whitfield. She'd been reported missing on Christmas Eve, 48 hours earlier. What made my hands shake as I documented the scene wasn't just finding her there, it was the temperature log I'd already reviewed. Someone with administrative access had been manually adjusting that freezer's digital readout every 6 hours since 1100 p.m. on December the 24th, maintaining it at exactly the right temperature to preserve her body, while making it appear the unit was malfunctioning. I'm Dr. Sarah Nakamura, and I'd been the chief medical examiner for King County for 11 years when I received the call that changed everything I thought I knew about institutional corruption. The hospital had reported Amanda's disappearance as a simple missing person case, a young woman who'd left her shift early, possibly distraught over a recent breakup. But the nurse who'd called my office directly, bypassing the usual channels, told a different story. She'd seen Amanda's ID badge register at the 6th floor medication room at 2:47 a.m. on Christmas morning, 7 hours after Amanda had supposedly left the building. Amanda had grown up in a small town outside Seattle, the daughter of 2 high school teachers who'd sacrificed everything to put her through respiratory therapy school. She'd graduated top of her class in 2004 and immediately took a position at St. Michael's, one of the most prestigious hospitals in the Pacific Northwest. Her colleagues described her as meticulous, almost obsessive about patient care. She kept a small notebook where she tracked every patient's oxygen saturation levels by hand, even though everything was digitally monitored. Her apartment walls were covered with thank you cards from patients and their families. She volunteered at a free clinic every Sunday morning, and she'd been saving money to open a respiratory therapy training center in underserved communities. On December 23, 2011, she'd told her mother on the phone that she was excited about Christmas. She'd been invited to spend it with her boyfriend's family for the first time. But Amanda had discovered something in the weeks before her death, something she'd documented in that same small notebook she always carried. On December 15th, she'd noticed that a terminal cancer patient named Robert Morrison had been administered a paralytic agent, pancuronium bromide, without a corresponding order in his chart. Morrison had died within hours, his death attributed to his advanced disease. Amanda had mentioned it to her supervisor, Dr. Gregory Thornton, who'd assured her it was simply a charting error, that the order had been placed verbally during an emergency. But Amanda had checked the nursing notes. There'd been no emergency. Morrison had been stable all day. On December 18th, another patient died under similar circumstances. This time, Amanda had been more thorough. She'd photographed the medication administration record with her phone before it could be altered. She'd documented the exact time, 3:22 p.m., and the name of the physician who'd allegedly given the verbal order, Dr. Marcus Chen, who'd actually been in surgery at that exact moment, confirmed by OR logs. Amanda had taken this evidence to the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. William Kavanagh, on December 20th. He'd thanked her for her diligence and promised a full investigation. He'd also asked her to surrender her phone and her notebook, which she'd reluctantly done, believing she was following proper protocol. 3 days later, on December 23rd, Amanda had received a text message at 7:45 p.m. from an unknown number. "You don't understand what you're interfering with." She'd shown this message to her boyfriend, Daniel Rodriguez, who'd urged her to go to the police. She'd promised she would, right after her Christmas Eve shift. She'd wanted to copy some additional files from the hospital's system first, medical records she'd been reviewing that showed a pattern. Over the previous 8 months, 17 terminally ill patients had died unexpectedly, all of them within 48 hours of updating their insurance beneficiary information, all of them enrolled in a special clinical trial that promised to cover their end-of-life care costs. Amanda had clocked in for her final shift at 10 p.m. on December the 24th. The charge nurse, Jennifer Sokoloff, later testified that Amanda had seemed nervous, distracted. She'd spent most of the evening in the medication room, inventorying supplies, something that wasn't part of her usual duties. At 11:43 p.m., the security cameras showed her leaving the 6th floor and heading toward the administrative wing, where patient records were stored. This was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The cameras in the administrative wing had mysteriously malfunctioned at 11:38 p.m., a 5-minute gap that the hospital's IT department attributed to a routine system update that had been scheduled weeks in advance. When I began my examination of Amanda's body on December 27th, the findings were immediately suspicious. Her cause of death was asphyxiation, but there were no external signs of strangulation. Her lungs showed the distinctive pattern of paralytic-induced respiratory failure. Toxicology would later confirm the presence of pancuronium bromide in her system, the same drug that had killed the patients she'd been investigating. But what made this murder particularly chilling was the medical sophistication it required. Someone had known exactly what dose to administer, how to inject it to minimize bruising, and how to position her body to make the asphyxiation appear natural. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was an execution performed by someone with advanced medical knowledge. I documented everything meticulously. The needle mark, partially concealed in her left armpit, the petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes that indicated she'd been conscious and aware as the paralysis spread through her body, the defensive wounds on her palms where she'd apparently scratched at her own throat as she struggled to breathe. I photographed every angle. I collected every tissue sample. I submitted this report to the King County Prosecutor's Office on December 29, 2011 at 4:15 p.m. At 9:00 a.m. on December 30th, I received a visit from 2 hospital administrators and the hospital's legal counsel. They were concerned about my findings. They suggested that Amanda might have taken the pancuronium bromide herself, that she'd been distraught over her relationship, that her investigation into patient deaths had been a manifestation of growing mental instability. They presented me with Amanda's employee file, which I'd never seen before. It contained 3 written warnings for medication errors, warnings dated within the past month, none of which had existed when I'd first requested her employment records. They showed me a psychiatric evaluation, supposedly conducted on December 22nd, diagnosing her with paranoid delusions and recommending immediate leave. The psychiatrist who'd allegedly performed this evaluation, Dr. Thomas Larson, denied ever seeing Amanda when I contacted him directly. I refused to change my findings. I made my position clear. Amanda Whitfield had been murdered, and the evidence pointed to someone within St. Michael's Hospital. The hospital's attorney, Victoria Chen, leaned forward in her chair and spoke very carefully. "Dr. Nakamura," she said, "St. Michael's is the largest employer in this county. We provide health care to 40% of the region's population. A scandal like this would be devastating, not just to the hospital, but to the community." I thought about them. Then I released my full autopsy report to the prosecutor's office, unchanged. I also sent copies to Amanda's parents and to 3 investigative journalists I'd worked with on previous cases. Within a week, the story broke. Hospital respiratory therapist murdered after discovering euthanasia scheme, read the headline in the Seattle Tribune on January 6, 2012. The article detailed Amanda's investigation and my findings. It named Dr. Gregory Thornton and Dr. William Kavanagh as potential suspects. It revealed the clinical trial and its suspicious patient mortality rate. The backlash was immediate and coordinated. On January 9th, the Washington State Medical Board opened an investigation into my conduct based on a complaint alleging I'd violated patient confidentiality by releasing Amanda's autopsy report without proper authorization. On January 12th, King County's elected prosecutor, Robert Petroff, held a press conference announcing that there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone in Amanda's death, that her death was being ruled as undetermined, pending further investigation. He did not mention my report or my findings. On January 15th, at 6:30 a.m., two FBI agents arrived at my home with a warrant for my arrest. I was charged with evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. The allegation was that I'd falsified toxicology reports in Amanda's case and two others, that I'd been running a private consulting business using the county's laboratory equipment, and that I'd been accepting payments from attorneys to provide favorable testimony. Every single charge was fabricated. The evidence they presented, laboratory logs, financial records, email correspondence, had been expertly forged. My attorney, Michael Santos, spent 6 months fighting these charges. During that time, I was suspended from my position without pay. My professional reputation was systematically destroyed in the media. The criminal charges were eventually dropped in July 2012 due to prosecutorial discretion, but the damage was permanent. I was not reinstated to my position. The medical board revoked my license in September 2012, citing the same fabricated evidence that had been used in the criminal case. I appealed. I fought. I presented expert witnesses who testified that the evidence against me was fraudulent. Nothing mattered. The system had decided I was guilty because I'd challenged an institution that was too important to fail. Meanwhile, the investigation into Amanda's death quietly disappeared. Dr. Thornton resigned from St. Michael's in February 2012 and immediately took a position at a prestigious hospital in Boston. Dr. Kavner retired in April with full benefits and honors. The clinical trial was discontinued, but no official explanation was ever provided. The 17 suspicious patient deaths were never investigated. Amanda's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit that was settled out of court in October 2012 for an undisclosed amount, with a confidentiality agreement that prevented them from discussing the case publicly. I've spent the last 13 years trying to rebuild my life. I work as a consultant now, helping families navigate suspicious death investigations, but I'll never practice medicine again. I live in a small apartment in Tacoma, and every Christmas Eve I think about Amanda Whitfield and the notebook she carried, filled with the names of patients who deserved better. I think about the 3 minutes of consciousness she must have experienced as the paralytic shut down her respiratory system, knowing exactly what was happening to her, unable to call for help. I think about the institutional machinery that closed ranks to protect itself, that sacrificed one dedicated healthcare worker to maintain its reputation and its revenue stream. If anyone reading this has information about the deaths at St. Michael's Hospital between May and December of 2011, particularly the clinical trial for terminal cancer patients, please come forward. The Seattle Tribune maintains a confidential tip line. Amanda's parents are still seeking answers. The truth deserves to be told, even if the justice system has decided it's too expensive to pursue. Story 2. The nursing home on Christmas morning. Blood doesn't spray in a straight line from a fall. It arcs, following the trajectory of the body's descent and the pressure of the cardiovascular system at the moment of impact. When I arrived at Evergreen Senior Living at 7:15 a.m. on December 25, 2013, and saw the blood pattern on the wall beside room 318, I knew immediately that the story I'd been told was incomplete. The facility director, a nervous woman named Patricia Morrison, had called my office to report an accidental death. A 76-year-old resident named Harold Jensen, who'd allegedly fallen while attempting to use the bathroom alone, striking his head on the edge of the sink. But the blood on that wall was horizontal, not vertical. It had been deposited while Harold was already on the ground, while someone was standing over him. I'm Detective James Whitmore, and I'd been investigating elder abuse cases in Portland, Oregon for 8 years when I walked into that nursing home on Christmas morning. I'd seen enough staged accident scenes to recognize one within the first 5 minutes. The problem was that everyone at Evergreen was insisting this was just a tragic fall, and the pressure to accept that narrative, especially on Christmas, was enormous. Harold had no close family, just a niece in California who'd visited twice in the past 3 years. He'd been a widower for 15 years, a retired postal worker who'd spent his entire career walking the same route through southeast Portland. His neighbors from his old apartment building still sent him cards. He'd been an amateur painter, specializing in watercolor landscapes of Oregon's coastline. His room at Evergreen was filled with his work, small paintings of misty beaches and rocky outcroppings that he'd give away to anyone who showed interest. Harold had been admitted to Evergreen in March 2012 after a minor stroke left him needing daily assistance with basic tasks. He'd adapted well to institutional life, according to the notes in his file. He participated in activities, befriended other residents, and never complained. But in the weeks before his death, something had changed. On December 3, 2013, Harold had filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Human Services, alleging systematic medication theft at Evergreen. He'd claimed that residents' pain medications were being diverted, that staff members were falsifying administration records, and that residents who complained were being over-sedated to keep them quiet. The state investigator assigned to Harold's complaint, a social worker named Maria Delgado, had conducted a preliminary inspection on December 11th. She'd found minor charting irregularities, but nothing that rose to the level of criminal conduct. She'd concluded her report with a recommendation for improved staff training. Harold had been furious. He'd called Maria directly on December 13th and told her she'd missed the evidence because she'd announced her inspection date in advance, giving staff time to hide their operation. He'd said he had proof, a detailed log he'd been keeping for 6 months, documenting every instance of missing medication, every suspicious behavior, every resident who'd been inexplicably drugged into silence. He'd promised to mail this log to her office after Christmas. On the night of December 24th, Harold had been particularly agitated. The nurse on duty, a woman named Christina Berg, had noted in her shift report that Harold had refused his evening medication, claiming he didn't trust the staff to give him what was actually prescribed. He'd accused her of being part of the theft ring. She documented this as increased confusion and possible paranoia, symptoms she attributed to his previous stroke. At 11:30 p.m., she'd administered a sedative, Ativan, according to the medication log, to help him sleep. At 6:45 a.m. on Christmas morning, another nurse, David Chen, had found Harold's body on the floor of his bathroom, blood pooling beneath his head. When I examined Harold's body, I found multiple points of trauma that were inconsistent with a single fall. There was the obvious injury to his right temple, the one that had caused the visible bleeding, but there was also bruising on his upper arms, the distinctive finger mark pattern that indicates someone grabbed him forcefully. There was a contusion on his lower back. And most significantly, there was a small puncture wound on his left inner arm, partially obscured by the sleeve of his pajamas. This wound was fresh, made within the hours before his death. When the medical examiner's preliminary toxicology screen came back 3 days later, it showed not just the Ativan that Christina Berg had documented, but also a massive dose of morphine, enough to severely depress respiratory function in a man of Harold's age and health status. I began interviewing staff members on December 26th. Everyone had the same story. Harold was a confused old man who'd become increasingly paranoid in his final weeks. The complaint he'd filed was baseless, the product of a mind damaged by stroke. No one had seen anything unusual on Christmas Eve. The night shift had been quiet. The building had been understaffed, as it always was on holidays, but nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Christina Berg, the nurse who'd given Harold his documented medication, had clocked out at midnight. David Chen had clocked in at 600 a.m. But one nurse's aide, a young man named Carlos Ruiz, pulled me aside on December the 27th as I was leaving the facility. He was scared, visibly shaking as he spoke. He told me that Christina Berg and 2 other nurses, Jennifer Walsh and Thomas Brooks, had been systematically stealing residents' narcotics for at least 2 years, possibly longer. They would administer half doses or placebos to residents in severe pain, then pocket the remaining medication to sell. Residents who noticed or complained were either over-sedated or, in a few cases, transferred to different facilities with documentation of behavioral problems that made them seem unreliable. Carlos had witnessed this countless times but had been too afraid to report it. He was 22 years old, supporting his mother and two younger siblings, and he couldn't afford to lose his job or become a target. I asked Carlos about the log that Harold had supposedly been keeping. Carlos knew exactly what I was talking about. He'd seen Harold working on it, a small spiral notebook that Harold kept hidden in a locked drawer in his room. The drawer's key was on a chain that Harold wore around his neck. Carlos had looked for the notebook after Harold's death. He'd known it was important, but it was gone. The drawer had been forced open, the key still hanging around Harold's neck when his body was discovered. I got a warrant to search the nursing home's administrative offices on December 30th. What I found was a systematic pattern of fraud that extended far beyond simple medication theft. Evergreen was billing Medicare for medications that were never administered, for procedures that were never performed, for staffing levels that didn't exist. The facility's owners, a private equity company based in Delaware, had been systematically extracting every possible dollar from the operation while minimizing costs. The theft of resident medications was just one small part of a much larger scheme. And Harold's notebook, which would have documented the medication theft in detail, was nowhere to be found. I arrested Christina Berg on January 3, 2014, charging her with Harold's murder. The arrest was based on the forensic evidence. The morphine in Harold's system that she hadn't documented, the bruising pattern consistent with forcible restraint, and the timeline that placed her alone with Harold during the crucial hours. She denied everything. Her attorney, an expensive criminal defense lawyer named Richard Morrison, argued that the morphine must have been administered by someone else during the gap between shifts, that the bruising was consistent with nurses helping Harold move around during the previous day, and that there was no physical evidence placing Christina in Harold's room at the time of death. The prosecution's case began to fall apart almost immediately. The medical examiner, Dr. Eric Larson, suddenly revised his findings, stating that the morphine level in Harold's system was potentially consistent with accumulated doses from previous days, that the time of death was uncertain, and that the head injury could have resulted from a fall. When I challenged these revisions, which contradicted everything in his preliminary report, he said he'd consulted with outside experts who'd helped him reach a more accurate conclusion. He refused to name these experts. My captain, a longtime veteran named Robert Santos, told me to back off, that we didn't have enough evidence to prove murder, that we should accept a plea deal for negligent homicide at best. I refused. I continued investigating. I tracked down two former Evergreen employees who'd quit in the previous year, both of whom confirmed the medication theft operation. I found family members of three other residents who died under suspicious circumstances in 2012 and 2013, deaths that had been attributed to natural causes, but that showed similar patterns: complaints about missing medication, sudden oversedation, unexplained falls. I built a case that showed Evergreen wasn't just guilty of one murder, but of systematically abusing and killing residents who threatened to expose their fraud. On January 28, 2014, the charges against Christina Berg were dropped. The prosecutor's office issued a statement saying that, after careful review of all available evidence, they determined they couldn't prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Harold Jensen's death was officially ruled accidental. The nursing home was fined $50,000 by the state for charting irregularities, a fraction of a single day's revenue. Christina Berg kept her nursing license. 2 weeks later, on February 12th, I was called into my captain's office and told I was being transferred to property crimes, effective immediately. The official reason was departmental restructuring. The real reason, which Captain Santos explained to me off the record, was that I'd made powerful people uncomfortable. Evergreen Senior Living was part of a chain of 30 facilities across the Pacific Northwest, generating millions in revenue and employing thousands. The private equity owners had relationships with city council members, state legislators, campaign donors. My investigation was threatening those relationships. I was told, very clearly, that if I wanted to keep my job and my pension, I would accept the transfer and stop asking questions about nursing home deaths. I accepted the transfer. I had a wife and 2 kids to support. But I kept Harold's case file, and I've spent the last 11 years following the pattern. Since Harold's death, there have been 23 more suspicious deaths at facilities owned by the same private equity company. Elderly residents who fall unexpectedly, who suffer sudden cardiac events, who develop infections that don't respond to treatment. In every case, the resident had either filed a complaint or was known to be planning one. In every case, the death was ruled natural or accidental. In every case, the investigation was perfunctory, and no one was held accountable. If you have a loved one in a nursing home, particularly one owned by Cornerstone Care Partners, the company that operates Evergreen and its sister facilities, please be vigilant. Document everything. Visit frequently and at varying times. Check medication records carefully, and if something seems wrong, if your family member seems oversedated or frightened or reluctant to speak freely, trust your instincts. Harold Jensen trusted the system to protect him. He was wrong, and it cost him his life. Story 3. The Christmas shopping mall fire. The emergency exit door was chained shut from the outside. I know this because I was the one who found the chain, still warm to the touch, when I finally forced my way through the debris at 4:18 a.m. on December the 26th, 2009. Inside that exit, in the stairwell behind the locked door, were the bodies of 11 people. 3 families with young children who'd been trapped during the fire that consumed Cascade Mall in Bellingham, Washington on Christmas night. They died from smoke inhalation less than 10 feet from safety, their hands still bearing the marks where they'd beaten on that door, screaming for help that never came. The fire marshal's preliminary report, released 48 hours later, called it a tragic accident caused by faulty electrical wiring in the mall's aging infrastructure. But I'm Captain Nicole Alvarez, and I'd been the lead fire investigator for Whatcom County for 14 years, and I knew what accelerant smells like. I knew what electrical fires look like. And the burn patterns I documented at Cascade Mall on that terrible morning told a different story. A story of arson, of multiple ignition points, and of a deliberate attempt to trap people inside. The fire had started at approximately 8:45 p.m. on December 25th, during extended holiday shopping hours. Cascade Mall was a sprawling 2-story structure built in 1982, showing its age but still beloved by the local community. It housed 47 retail stores, a food court, and a small movie theater. Christmas night was always busy. Last-minute shoppers looking for deals, families with children spending gift cards, teenagers hanging out because everything else was closed. The security cameras showed approximately 320 people inside the mall when the fire began. Among those people were the Castellano family, parents Anthony and Isabella, and their 3 children aged 7, 5, and 3. They'd driven up from Seattle to visit Isabella's parents and had stopped at the mall to let the kids play in the indoor playground. There were the Miyamoto twins, Kenji and Yuki, 16-year-old brother and sister shopping for their mother's birthday. There was Pastor Frank Lindholm and his wife Grace, who'd been married for 41 years and had spent every Christmas evening walking through the mall, a tradition they'd maintained since the mall first opened. There was Amanda Torres, a single mother of 2 young boys, working her retail job at the Gap to make rent. There was Jason Brightwater, a university student home for the holidays. 11 people in total who never made it out, who died in that stairwell because someone had decided their lives were worth less than whatever profit was to be made from insurance fraud. The first 911 call came in at 8:47 p.m., a frantic report from a mall employee that smoke was pouring from the east wing near the electronics store. By 8:50 p.m., multiple fires were burning throughout the building, in the electronics store, in the furniture showroom on the 2nd floor, and in the storage area behind the food court. The sprinkler system activated at 8:51 p.m., but the water pressure was inexplicably low, barely enough to dampen the flames. The fire alarm system was blaring, but the automated announcement kept telling people to remain calm, that the situation was under control, that security was investigating. This announcement played on a loop for 7 crucial minutes while the fires spread, while smoke filled the corridors, while people tried to decide if they should really evacuate or wait for official guidance. The main exits became blocked by smoke and flames within minutes. The mall had 6 emergency exits, clearly marked with illuminated signs. But as panicked shoppers reached these exits, they found problems. The exit near the movie theater opened into a loading dock where delivery trucks were parked, blocking the escape route. The exit by the food court opened onto a steep embankment with no stairs or pathway, a 15-foot drop in the dark. And the exit in the East Wing, the one closest to where the Castellano family and the others were trying to escape, was chained shut. I arrived on scene at 9:35 p.m., 48 minutes after the first alarm. The mall was fully engulfed, flames shooting through the roof, smoke visible for miles. Fire crews from 6 different departments were battling the blaze, but it was clear we were in rescue mode now, not containment. I organized search teams to sweep the perimeter, looking for anyone who'd managed to escape and might need medical attention. That's when I heard about the people potentially trapped inside. A mall employee, a young woman named Sofia Ramos, was being treated for smoke inhalation and kept screaming about the locked door, about people trapped in the East Wing stairwell. She'd tried to help them. She'd pulled on the door from the outside, but the chain was secured with a commercial-grade padlock that she couldn't break. We finally extinguished the main fire around 3:02 a.m. on December 26th. The building was structurally unstable. Parts of the second floor had collapsed, but I insisted we search every exit, every stairwell, every possible space where people might have sought shelter. At 4:18 a.m., I reached the East Wing emergency exit. The door was steel, designed to withstand fire for up to 2 hours. It had done its job. The people inside the stairwell had been protected from the flames, but they'd been trapped by the chain. A thick logging chain wrapped through the door handles and secured with a padlock, now melted but still functional enough to keep the door sealed. When we finally cut through that chain and opened the door, the scene inside broke something in me that's never fully healed. The bodies were arranged in a heartbreaking tableau of final moments. Anthony Castellano was at the front, his hands bloodied from pounding on the door. Behind him was Isabella, shielding her 3 children with her body. The Miyamoto twins were together, arms wrapped around each other. Pastor Lindholm was holding his wife, her face buried in his chest. Amanda Torres had positioned herself between her 2 boys, trying to protect them from the smoke. Jason Brightwater was at the back, his phone in his hand. He'd been trying to call 911, but there had been no signal in the stairwell. I documented everything according to protocol. I photographed the chain and the padlock. I measured the door and the stairwell. I collected samples from the burn patterns I'd noted throughout the mall. I interviewed Sofia Ramos in detail about what she'd seen. And then I began the real investigation, the one that would eventually cost me everything. The burn patterns were consistent with liquid accelerant, probably gasoline, poured in multiple locations. The low water pressure in the sprinkler system wasn't due to equipment failure. The main water valve had been manually adjusted to 30% capacity. The delayed evacuation announcement wasn't a malfunction. Someone had overridden the automatic system and played a recorded message designed to keep people inside longer, and the chain on the emergency exit had been placed there recently. The padlock showed no rust, no wear, no exposure to weather. It had been put there deliberately, probably within days of the fire. I submitted my findings to the county prosecutor on December 29, 2009. I stated clearly that this was arson, that it was premeditated, and that the evidence pointed to someone with detailed knowledge of the mall's security and safety systems. I recommended a criminal investigation focusing on the mall's ownership and management. The mall was owned by a regional real estate development company called Pacific Horizons, which had been trying to sell the property for 3 years. The land was worth millions, but the aging mall building was a liability. They'd been unable to find a buyer willing to take on the renovation costs. But with the building destroyed and a substantial insurance payout, the land suddenly became much more valuable. My report was received and acknowledged. I was told an investigation would be opened, but days turned into weeks and nothing happened. The official fire marshal's report, issued on January 15, 2010, contradicted my findings. It concluded that the fire had been accidental, caused by faulty wiring in the electronics store. It made no mention of accelerants, of the manipulated sprinkler system, of the chained door. When I protested, when I presented my physical evidence and my photographs, I was told that additional analysis by outside experts had determined my conclusions were incorrect, that I'd been working under extreme stress in the aftermath of a traumatic event, that my judgment had been compromised. The families of the victims filed wrongful death lawsuits against Pacific Horizons and the mall's management company. These cases should have been supported by my findings, by the physical evidence of arson and criminal negligence. Instead, the official fire marshal's report was used to defeat their claims. The defense argued that the fire was an unforeseeable accident, that the emergency exits had been accessible, that the victims had simply become disoriented in the smoke. The chain that I'd documented, that I'd photographed, that I'd personally cut through. The defense claimed it was placed there after the fire by first responders, a safety measure to secure the unstable building. Sofia Ramos, the employee who'd tried to save the trapped people, changed her testimony. She now said she'd been mistaken, confused, that maybe the door hadn't been chained after all. The lawsuits were all dismissed or settled for minimal amounts by December 2010. Pacific Horizons received an insurance payout of $23 million. They sold the mall property, now a cleared lot, in March 2011 for $18 million to a developer who built luxury condominiums. The total profit from the fire exceeded $35 million. No one was ever charged with arson or murder. I was forced into early retirement in June 2011 at age 47. The official reason was budget cuts and departmental restructuring. The real reason was that I'd refused to accept the official narrative, that I'd continued speaking to journalists and to the victims' families, that I'd become a problem that needed to disappear. My pension was reduced because I hadn't completed my full 20 years of service. My professional reputation was destroyed by whispers that I'd been unstable after the fire, that I'd become obsessed with conspiracy theories, that I couldn't accept the findings of qualified experts. I've spent the last 14 years living in a small cabin outside Bellingham, trying to find peace with the fact that I couldn't get justice for those 11 people who died in that stairwell. Every Christmas, I visit their graves. I tell them I'm sorry. I tell them I tried. And I keep a complete file of my original investigation, copies of every photograph, every measurement, every piece of evidence that proves Cascade Mall was deliberately burned with people inside. If anyone reading this has information about Pacific Horizons operations in 2009, about who had access to the mall's security systems, about who might have ordered that emergency exit to be chained, please contact the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office or the FBI's Seattle Field Office. The statute of limitations for murder never expires, and those 11 people deserve better than to be remembered as victims of an accident that never happened. Story 4. The holiday cruise disappearance. The surveillance footage ended at exactly 2:23 a.m. on December the 27th, 2015. One moment, the camera showed an empty section of deck on the Royal Constellation's starboard side. The next moment, nothing. Not static, not a malfunction, just a deliberate gap in the recording that lasted exactly 14 minutes. When the footage resumed at 2:37 a.m., there was a wet footprint trail leading away from the railing, and passenger Monica Brennan was gone. I'm Special Agent Peter Novak with the FBI's Criminal Investigation Division, assigned to maritime crimes. I've investigated 17 disappearances from cruise ships during my career, and I can tell you that the official explanation is almost always the same. Intoxicated passenger, Tragic accident, fell overboard. Body never recovered. In Monica's case, the cruise line followed this script perfectly. But I'd been tracking a pattern for 3 years, and Monica's disappearance fit that pattern in ways that made my investigation a threat to a billion-dollar industry. Monica Brennan was 42 years old, a forensic accountant from Minneapolis who specialized in corporate fraud investigations. She'd been working for the past 8 months on a case involving offshore tax shelters and shell corporations, following money trails that led through multiple countries and involved some of America's largest companies. She'd decided to take a Christmas cruise, her first vacation in 2 years, to decompress and finalize her findings. She'd boarded the Royal Constellation in Miami on December 22nd for a 7-day Caribbean voyage, traveling alone but planning to meet up with college friends who were also on the ship. The Royal Constellation was one of the newest ships in the Galaxy Cruises fleet, a massive vessel carrying 3,800 passengers and 1,400 crew members. It offered everything the modern cruise industry promises: luxury accommodations, gourmet dining, world-class entertainment, exotic ports of call, labor and safety regulations, operating in international waters where jurisdiction is murky, policing themselves with minimal government oversight. Monica's friends, Emma Sorensen, Rachel Kim, and Julia Blackwood, later told me that Monica had seemed distracted during the first few days of the cruise. She'd spent a lot of time in her stateroom, working on her laptop, making phone calls. On December 25th, Christmas Day, she'd seemed more relaxed, finally letting herself enjoy the vacation. They'd had dinner together, attended a comedy show, spent time at the ship's casino. Around midnight, Monica had said she was tired and headed back to her cabin on Deck 9. Her friends had stayed at the casino until around 2:00 a.m., then gone to their own cabins. The ship's security cameras showed Monica returning to her cabin at 12:47 a.m. She'd changed clothes, from her dress into shorts and a t-shirt, and left her cabin again at 1:15 a.m. This wasn't unusual. She'd told her friends she sometimes had trouble sleeping and liked to walk the open decks late at night when they were quiet. The cameras tracked her movement through the ship's corridors, up to Deck 11, then out onto the exterior deck. At 2:23 a.m., she was visible on the starboard side, standing at the railing, looking out at the ocean. She was alone. She was not visibly intoxicated. She was not acting erratically, and then the footage went dark. When the cameras came back online at 2:37 a.m., Monica was gone. But there were those footprints, wet marks on the teak decking that led from the railing back toward the interior of the ship. Adult-sized footprints, larger than Monica's size 7 shoes. The prints showed the distinctive tread pattern of the non-slip deck shoes that crew members wore. And there was something else I noticed when I reviewed the footage. A maintenance panel on the exterior wall, near where Monica had been standing, was hanging open. That panel housed the manual override controls for the deck security cameras. Monica was reported missing when she didn't show up for breakfast with her friends on December the 27th. Ship security conducted a search of her cabin and the surrounding areas. They found her keycard in her cabin, her phone still charging on the bedside table, her laptop sitting open on the desk. They found her purse with her ID and credit cards. They found everything except Monica herself. The ship's captain, a Norwegian veteran named Olaf Bergstrom, made the required notification to the Coast Guard. He also made the decision to continue the cruise to its planned ports, rather than turning back or diverting for a more extensive search. This decision, he later explained, was based on the probability that Monica had already been in the water for hours and that immediate Coast Guard response would be more effective than the ship circling back. I boarded the Royal Constellation when it returned to Miami on December the 29th. I interviewed crew and passengers for 3 days while the ship sat in port. I examined Monica's cabin and her belongings. I reviewed every second of available security footage. And I discovered that Monica hadn't just been working on her normal case during the cruise. She'd stumbled onto something new. Something related to Galaxy Cruises itself. On her laptop, I found a hidden folder containing financial documents she'd accessed through various corporate databases she had legitimate access to as part of her work. These documents showed that Galaxy Cruises was engaged in systematic tax fraud on a massive scale, using the same type of offshore shell corporations and phantom transactions that Monica had been investigating in other contexts. But there was more. Evidence of labor trafficking, of crew members being charged illegal recruitment fees and then trapped on ships with debt they could never repay. Evidence of environmental crimes, of illegal waste dumping, evidence of systematic underreporting of crimes on ships, of passengers who'd been assaulted or robbed, or worse, their cases never properly investigated because admitting crime would hurt the cruise line's reputation and stock price. Monica had been meticulous. She documented everything, cross-referenced multiple sources, built a case that could bring federal charges and potentially billions in fines and penalties. And according to her laptop's activity logs, she'd spent the evening of December 26th, just hours before her disappearance, writing a detailed summary of her findings. She'd drafted an email to her boss at the accounting firm and to a contact at the Justice Department's Corporate Fraud Division. The email was still in her drafts folder, unsent, before sending it. But someone had known what she'd found. I discovered keystroke logging software on Monica's laptop, sophisticated malware that had been capturing everything she typed and sending it to an external server. The software had been installed on December 24th while Monica was at dinner and compromised her computer. Someone had been reading her work in real time, watching as she built her case against Galaxy Cruises. I identified 3 crew members who'd had both the access and the opportunity to install the malware and to be on Deck 11 during the camera blackout. One was a bartender named Stefan Kozlov, who'd served Monica drinks several times during the cruise. Another was a maintenance technician named Luis Herrera, who had master access to all cabins and to the security system. The third was a member of the ship's security team, a former police officer from South Africa named Winston Ndlovu. All 3 men had been working the night of December 26th. All 3 had been employees of Galaxy Cruises for less than a year, and all 3 had backgrounds that suggested they were more than just cruise ship workers. Kozlov had served in the Russian military. Herrera had worked for a private security contractor in Colombia, and Ndlovu had been dismissed from the police force under circumstances that were never fully explained. I built a case for investigation. I presented my evidence to my supervisors at the FBI. I recommended that all 3 men be detained and questioned, that Monica's disappearance be treated as a homicide, that Galaxy Cruises be served with warrants for all their financial records and security footage. I argued that this was part of a larger pattern. I'd identified 5 other cases in the previous 3 years where passengers with legal, accounting, or investigative backgrounds had disappeared from Galaxy Cruises' ships under suspicious circumstances. My recommendations were not followed. Instead, I was called into a meeting with my assistant director and 2 attorneys from the Department of Justice. They explained that Galaxy Cruises was a major corporation, that they employed over 100,000 people worldwide, that they were a significant contributor to the Florida economy and to tourism throughout the Caribbean. They explained that investigating a company of this size based on circumstantial evidence would require extraordinary resources and would likely result in lengthy legal battles. They explained that Monica's case, tragic as it was, would probably never be solved. Her body was gone, there were no witnesses, the evidence was ambiguous at best. They told me that the case would be classified as a presumed accidental death by drowning, that the Coast Guard had conducted a thorough search and found nothing, and that further investigation would not be a productive use of federal resources. They told me this very clearly, very firmly, in a way that made it obvious this was not a suggestion. I continued investigating anyway. I did it on my own time, using my own resources. I contacted Monica's family and her employer, sharing what I'd learned. I reached out to journalists who'd reported on cruise ship crimes. I tried to build public pressure for a real investigation, and then, in March 2016, I was reassigned. I was transferred from criminal investigations to background checks for security clearances. A desk job with no fieldwork, no cases, no meaningful purpose. The transfer was presented as a lateral move, a change in departmental priorities. The message was clear. I retired from the FBI in 2018 at age 51, rather than spend the rest of my career in bureaucratic purgatory. I now work as a private investigator, specializing in cases that law enforcement won't touch. I've been hired by the families of 3 other cruise ship disappearance victims, and I've found evidence in each case that suggests something far more sinister than the drunk passenger falls overboard narrative that the industry promotes. Monica Brennan's body was never found. The case was officially closed in June 2016 as an accidental death. Galaxy Cruises was never charged with any crimes. The 3 crew members I'd identified as suspects all left the company within months of my investigation and disappeared into various parts of the world. Monica's laptop, which contained all her evidence about the company's criminal activities, was returned to her family after the FBI had examined it thoroughly. Except the hard drive had been completely wiped, all her files gone, even the malware removed. If you're reading this and you're considering taking a cruise, understand that you'll be entering a legal gray area where your normal protections don't fully apply. If something happens to you in international waters, if you're assaulted or robbed or you disappear, the investigation will be conducted by the cruise line's own security team, people who work for the company and whose primary loyalty is to protecting that company's reputation. The FBI's jurisdiction is limited. The Coast Guard can search, but they can't investigate crimes, and the cruise lines have no obligation to fully cooperate with any investigation. Monica deserved better. She was a brilliant investigator who'd uncovered massive corporate crimes, and she died because she was a threat to profits. Kamal. I'm still fighting for answers, and Monica's family is still waiting for justice. Story 5. The Ski Resort Avalanche. The avalanche beacon was still transmitting when we found it, 14 hours after the snowslide that buried 6 people on the Paradise Peak Ski Resort's north face on December 28, 2018. The beacon was lodged in a tree, 40 feet above where the avalanche had deposited its debris field, attached to a backpack that contained a shovel, a probe, and a detailed map of the mountain with specific areas marked in red ink. The beacon's owner, a 31-year-old ski patrol member named Tyler Hutchinson, was nowhere near the device. His body was eventually found 3 days later, 2 miles away from the avalanche zone, in an area that had never been touched by the snowslide. I'm Dr. Rachel Thornton, a forensic pathologist specializing in cold weather deaths and mountain rescue situations. I've worked with search and recovery teams in Colorado for 19 years, examining the remains of climbers, skiers, and hikers who died in the mountains. Tyler's case was the first time I'd ever seen a victim of an avalanche who showed signs of death by trauma that occurred before the avalanche hit, whose injuries included a gunshot wound to the upper back that had nothing to do with the natural disaster that supposedly killed him. Paradise Peak Resort was one of Colorado's premier ski destinations, a sprawling complex of groomed runs, backcountry access, luxury lodges, and upscale amenities. It attracted wealthy tourists from around the world, generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue, and was the economic backbone of Summit County. Tyler had worked there for 8 years, starting as a lift operator and working his way up to senior patrol member, one of the most respected positions on the mountain. His colleagues described him as dedicated, safety-conscious, someone who knew every inch of Paradise Peak and who'd saved dozens of lives through his swift responses to accidents and his expertise in avalanche assessment. But Tyler had been troubled in the weeks before his death. He'd discovered that the resort's owner, a development company called Summit Ventures Group, had been systematically overriding the ski patrol's safety closures, reopening dangerous terrain during high avalanche risk periods because turning away customers was bad for business. Tyler had documented 13 instances in the 2018-2019 season where areas he'd closed had been reopened by management within hours, sometimes while he was still conducting assessments. On December 27th, Tyler had submitted a formal safety report to the resort's operations director, Arthur Morrison, detailing his concerns and recommending a comprehensive review of the resort's safety protocols. He'd also sent copies of this report to the Colorado Avalanche Information Center and to the state's Ski Area Safety Board. He'd told Sandra that if management didn't take his concerns seriously, he was prepared to go public, to talk to journalists, to risk his job to prevent what he believed was an inevitable tragedy. The next morning, December 28th, Tyler had arrived for his 6:00 a.m. shift. He'd conducted his usual early morning avalanche assessment and had recommended closing the north face due to unstable snow conditions. High winds overnight had created heavy, wind-loaded slabs on steep slopes. His recommendation was logged in the patrol's records at 7:15 a.m. At 7:45 a.m., Arthur Morrison had overridden the closure, citing perfect weather conditions and a fully booked holiday weekend. The north face opened to skiers at 8:30 a.m. Tyler had spent the morning monitoring conditions, checking the areas that concerned him most. His GPS tracker, which all patrol members wore, showed him conducting multiple assessments between 8:30 and 11 a.m. At 11:47 a.m., witnesses reported seeing Tyler skiing rapidly toward the base lodge, appearing agitated. Security cameras in the corridor outside Morrison's office showed Tyler leaving at 12:03 p.m., carrying his backpack and some papers from Morrison's desk. At 12:34 p.m., a massive avalanche swept down the north face, a slide that began at approximately 11,200 feet elevation and ran for over 1,500 vertical feet, carrying an estimated 200,000 cubic feet of snow. 6 skiers were caught in the slide. 4 of them survived, dug out by other skiers and patrol members within minutes. 2 died: Jennifer Walsh, a 29-year-old ski instructor from Vermont, and Marcus Chen, a 42-year-old surgeon from Boston who was skiing with his teenage daughter. Both were experienced skiers who'd been following proper safety protocols, staying in bounds, skiing during operating hours. They died because the resort had opened dangerous terrain against the patrol's recommendation. The search for Tyler began immediately, with the assumption that he'd been caught in the avalanche while responding to the emergency. His GPS tracker showed his last location as the upper north face, in the exact area where the slide had originated. His avalanche beacon was transmitting. Rescue teams spent hours probing the debris field, finding nothing. It wasn't until 2:00 a.m. on December 29th that a search dog located Tyler's beacon in that tree, far from the debris, with Tyler nowhere nearby. And it wasn't until December 31st that snowmobilers found his body in a completely different area, in terrain that made no sense for someone who'd been caught in an avalanche. When I examined Tyler's body, the findings were impossible to reconcile with the official narrative. He had a single gunshot wound that had entered his back between his shoulder blades and exited through his chest, damaging his heart. He had defensive wounds on his hands, cuts and bruises consistent with a struggle. And most telling, he had very little snow in his airways, nothing like what you'd expect from someone who'd been buried in an avalanche. Tyler had died from the gunshot wound, probably within minutes, and his body had been moved to the remote location where it was found. The avalanche had been real, killing 2 people, but Tyler's death was murder made to look like a third avalanche casualty. The papers Tyler had taken from Morrison's office were gone, but I found copies of them in Tyler's locker at the patrol building. They were internal communications between Summit Ventures Group executives discussing their practice of overriding safety closures, complete with cost-benefit analyses that calculated the financial impact of closing terrain versus the statistical probability of serious accidents. I presented all of this to the Summit County Sheriff's Office, to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, to the district attorney. I provided medical evidence, documentary evidence, witness statements. I argued that Tyler had been murdered to silence his safety concerns, that his death was connected to a pattern of deliberate negligence that had killed 2 other people in the avalanche. I recommended murder charges against Arthur Morrison and possibly others in Paradise Peak's management. The response was a masterclass in institutional protection. An independent investigation was conducted by a firm hired by Summit Ventures Group itself. This investigation concluded that Tyler had likely confronted someone he believed was about to trigger the avalanche, perhaps a backcountry skier or someone conducting illegal explosives work, and had been shot in the confrontation. The gunshot wound was real, but it wasn't connected to the resort's management. It was a separate tragedy, a random act of violence in the backcountry. Families of Jennifer Walsh and Marcus Chen filed wrongful death lawsuits against Paradise Peak. These cases should have been strengthened by Tyler's documentation of the resort's safety violations. Instead, the resort's attorneys successfully argued that the avalanche had been an unpredictable natural disaster, that Tyler's concerns had been properly considered and reasonably overruled by experienced management, and that the victims had assumed the inherent risks of skiing. The lawsuits were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts in exchange for confidentiality agreements. No one was ever charged in Tyler's murder. The investigation into his death remained open but inactive. Arthur Morrison continued as operations director for another year before accepting a promotion to regional vice president. Summit Ventures Group implemented new safety communication protocols and issued press releases about their commitment to skier safety. Paradise Peak Resort's season passed sold out for the following winter. I left Colorado in 2020, unable to continue working in a state where I'd seen how thoroughly money and political influence could bury the truth. I now teach forensic pathology at a university in Montana, and I train search and rescue teams on how to properly document evidence in mountain deaths. I keep Tyler's case file in my office, along with files from 3 other ski resort deaths I've examined, where the circumstances suggest something beyond simple accidents. If you ski at Paradise Peak or any of the other resorts owned by Summit Ventures Group, and I'm not going to list them all here, but they operate 15 major ski areas across the western United States. Please be aware that profit decisions are being made about your safety. Check avalanche forecasts independently. Don't assume that because an area is open, it's safe. And if a ski patrol member tells you conditions are dangerous, believe them, even if management has overruled their closure. Tyler Hutchinson died trying to protect skiers from a company that valued revenue over lives. His murder has never been solved, and the people responsible remain in positions where they continue to make safety decisions for millions of skiers. If anyone has information about what happened to Tyler on December 28, 2018, about who might have confronted him in the back country, about management's response to his safety concerns, please contact the Colorado Bureau of Investigation or the FBI's Denver office. Tyler's family deserves answers, and the skiing public deserves to know the truth about how safety decisions are made at the resorts where they vacation. Story 6. The Airport Security Contractor. The biometric scanner was offline for exactly 18 minutes on December 23, 2016. During that window, between 3:47 p.m. and 4:05 p.m., someone with the correct credentials and knowledge of SeaTac International Airport security protocols could have moved through the airport's restricted areas without leaving any digital footprint. No facial recognition data, no fingerprint logs, no time-stamped badge scans. Just a gap in the system, later attributed to a routine software update that had been scheduled months in advance by a contractor that no longer existed. The scanner's administrator, a cybersecurity specialist named Austin Moreno, had noticed the planned outage 2 weeks earlier and had flagged it as suspicious in an internal memo to airport security leadership. The timing was problematic, right before Christmas, during the highest traffic period of the year. The contractor responsible, a company called CyberGuard Systems, had been awarded the airport's security technology contract earlier that year through a bidding process that Austin believed was rigged. I'm Naomi Silverstein, and I worked as an investigative journalist for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer for 23 years before my reporting on Austin's death cost me my career. I'd known Austin professionally. We'd worked together on a story about TSA checkpoint failures the previous year. When he died on Christmas Eve 2016, in what was officially ruled a suicide, I knew immediately something was wrong. Austin had reached out to me 3 days before his death, saying he had evidence of a massive security breach conspiracy involving airport contractors, federal officials, and potentially foreign intelligence agencies. He'd promised to give me documents. He'd never made it to our meeting. Austin had been found in his apartment on the morning of December 25th by his brother, Dylan Moreno, who'd come by to pick him up for Christmas dinner. Austin was hanging from a beam in his bedroom, a belt around his neck, a desk chair kicked over beneath him. There was no note. His apartment showed no signs of struggle. The Seattle Police Department's initial investigation concluded that Austin had killed himself, possibly due to work stress and depression. His family insisted this was impossible. Austin had been excited about the holidays, had been making plans for the new year, had shown no signs of suicidal ideation. I started investigating Austin's death on my own, reaching out to his colleagues at the airport and reviewing the work he'd been doing in the months before he died. What I discovered was a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond a single rigged contract. Airports over the previous 3 years, always through competitive bidding processes that somehow eliminated more qualified competitors. The company's ownership structure was deliberately opaque, hidden behind layers of shell corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada. Austin had been tracking CyberGuard's activities since they'd been awarded the SeaTac contract in March 2016. He'd found that their software contained hidden code that could disable security scanners remotely, that could alter screening results to allow specific individuals or items to pass through checkpoints without triggering alarms, and that transmitted copies of all screening data to servers located in countries with known intelligence operations against the United States. He documented this in detailed technical reports submitted to his supervisors, to the TSA's regional director, and to the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General. His reports had been received and acknowledged. He'd been thanked for his diligence, and then nothing had happened. No investigation was launched. CyberGuard's contract was not suspended. The software vulnerabilities were not addressed. When Austin had pressed his supervisors about the lack of response, he'd been told that his concerns were being evaluated at the appropriate level and that he should focus on his regular duties rather than conducting unauthorized security assessments. On December 20th, 2016, Austin had gained access to CyberGuard's server logs, through means I've never fully disclosed because they involved methods that were legally questionable but ethically necessary. These logs showed that the scheduled scanner outage on December 23rd was not for a software update. It was to allow someone to move through SeaTac's restricted areas during the Christmas travel rush, someone whose identity was too sensitive to risk normal screening protocols. The logs also showed that similar maintenance windows had been scheduled at other airports on the same day, creating a network of security gaps that could facilitate the movement of people or materials that would normally trigger alarms. Austin had downloaded these logs and had planned to give them to me, along with his full analysis of CyberGuard's operations. We'd scheduled a meeting for December 24th, 2:00 p.m. at a coffee shop downtown. He'd texted me at 11:30 a.m. that day saying he was worried he was being followed, that he'd noticed the same car parked outside his apartment for 3 days. I'd told him to go to the police, to not take any risks, to bring the documents to me later if he felt unsafe. His last text to me came at 1:15 p.m. "They're knocking on my door." He'd never texted again. When I arrived at Austin's apartment on December the 26th, after learning of his death, the documents were gone. His computers had been wiped. His phone was missing. The brother who'd found him said Austin's apartment had been neater than usual, as if someone had been through it removing specific items. The police investigation had found nothing suspicious, had concluded that Austin had cleaned his apartment before killing himself, a common behavior in suicide cases. I tried to access CyberGuard's server logs through Austin's methods, but the company's entire digital infrastructure had been restructured. The vulnerabilities he'd documented had been patched. The evidence of the scheduled security gaps had been erased. I contacted the airports where similar maintenance windows had been scheduled on December 23rd, trying to find out if anything unusual had occurred during those outages. I was stonewalled at every location. No one would talk to me. Everyone referred me to public affairs offices that provided scripted responses about how security was their top priority. I published what I could. A long investigative piece that ran on January 15, 2017, detailing Austin's concerns about CyberGuard and questioning the official ruling of suicide. The story generated some initial attention, but it was quickly buried by more immediate news cycles. Airport officials issued statements expressing confidence in their security contractors and characterizing Austin's allegations as the concerns of a single individual that had been properly investigated and found to be unsubstantiated. CyberGuard Systems issued a statement threatening legal action for defamation. 2 weeks after my article published, I was called into my editor's office and told that the newspaper had received a legal complaint from CyberGuard's attorneys. They were demanding a retraction and threatening a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for damage to their business reputation. My editor, a man I'd worked with for 15 years, told me that the paper couldn't afford the legal battle, that I'd need to issue a correction acknowledging that my reporting had been based on incomplete information. I refused. I stood by every fact in my article. I was fired on February 3, 2017. The real reason was that I'd become a liability, that my reporting had threatened powerful interests, and that the newspaper's corporate owners had decided I wasn't worth the risk. I was 49 years old, with 2 decades of investigative journalism experience, and I couldn't get hired anywhere else. Every news organization I approached had heard about the CyberGuard situation. No one wanted to touch me. I now work as a freelance researcher, scraping together a living by doing background investigations for attorneys and private security firms. I've continued investigating airport security contractor corruption on my own time, building a database of suspicious contracts, mysterious security gaps, and unexplained deaths of whistleblowers and security professionals. Austin's case is one of 17 similar deaths I've documented since 2014. Security experts, IT specialists, federal inspectors who'd raised concerns about contractor corruption and who'd died under circumstances ruled as suicides, accidents, or natural causes. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to see it. The airport security industry in the United States, which processes hundreds of millions of passengers annually and represents billions in federal contracts, has been systematically infiltrated by companies with hidden agendas. Some are purely profit-driven, cutting corners and creating vulnerabilities because thorough security is expensive. Others have more sinister purposes: foreign intelligence gathering, facilitating illegal movement of people and materials, creating backdoors that could be exploited for terrorism or smuggling. And the people who discover these vulnerabilities, who try to expose them, who believe that public safety should matter more than corporate profits, they die, and their deaths are dismissed as unrelated coincidences. Austin Moreno's death has never been reinvestigated. His technical findings about CyberGuard systems have never been independently verified. The company continues to hold security contracts at airports across the country. And the scheduled scanner outage on December 23, 2016, that 18-minute window that Austin believed was deliberately created to facilitate something illegal, no one has ever explained who benefited from that gap or what might have passed through SeaTac's security checkpoints during those crucial minutes. Comedian Austin believed that the truth mattered enough to risk his career and ultimately his life. The least I can do is keep asking the questions he died trying to answer. Story 7. The pharmaceutical company whistleblower. The clinical trial data didn't match the published results. It was a small discrepancy, the kind that might escape notice if you weren't looking carefully, but Dr. Isabel Cardoso had spent her entire career looking carefully. Patient 247 in the study had died from liver failure on day 43 of treatment. Not a typo, not a clerical error, a deliberate falsification of data that minimized the risks of a drug that would go on to be prescribed to millions of people. Isabel discovered this discrepancy on December 19, 2012, while reviewing archived data from clinical trials conducted by Meridian Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest drug companies in the United States. She was working as a research physician at Boston General Hospital, and she'd been asked to consult on a case involving a patient who'd developed severe liver damage while taking Vascural, a blood pressure medication that Meridian had brought to market 5 years earlier. The patient's symptoms were unusual, severe beyond what the published side effect profile would predict. Isabel had requested access to the original trial data to see if there were any similar cases that hadn't been properly reported. What she'd found instead was a systematic pattern of data manipulation spanning multiple clinical trials and multiple drugs. Patient deaths reclassified as withdrawals. Serious adverse events downgraded to minor complications. Efficacy data cherry-picked to show better results. And in the case of Vascural, specifically, at least 17 trial participants who'd developed serious liver damage, 3 of whom had died, none of which had been properly reported in the drug's approval documentation to the FDA. I'm Dr. Kenneth Okonkwo, and I worked as a forensic pathologist in Massachusetts for 26 years before my involvement in Isabel's case destroyed my ability to practice medicine. I'd met Isabel through professional conferences. We'd collaborated on a research paper about drug-induced organ failure, and when she died on Christmas morning 2012 in what was officially ruled a heart attack, I was the one who performed her autopsy. I was also the one who found the evidence that her death was not natural, evidence that led me down a path of discovery about pharmaceutical industry corruption that cost me everything. Isabel had been 53 years old, in excellent health, an avid runner who'd completed 3 marathons in the previous year. She had no history of heart disease, no risk factors, no warning signs. When her husband, Gabriel Cardoso, had found her unresponsive in their bed on the morning of December 25th, he'd called 911 immediately. Paramedics had attempted resuscitation, but Isabel had been dead for hours. The emergency room physician who'd pronounced her death had noted it as apparent cardiac arrest, likely due to arrhythmia, a common enough cause of sudden death that no one had initially questioned it, but Gabriel had been insistent that something was wrong. He'd told the hospital that Isabel had been perfectly healthy when they'd gone to bed the night before, that she'd had no symptoms, no complaints. He'd also told them that Isabel had been frightened in the days before her death, that she'd discovered something at work that had upset her profoundly, and that she'd been planning to report her findings to federal authorities after the holidays. The hospital had documented these concerns but had not considered them relevant to the medical determination of cause of death. I'd been asked to perform the autopsy because of my relationship with Isabel, because Gabriel had trusted me to be thorough. What I'd found was consistent with a heart attack in the most superficial sense. There was cardiac tissue damage, evidence of oxygen deprivation. But the pattern was wrong. The damage was too uniform, too widespread, not concentrated in the areas you'd expect from a blocked coronary artery. And when I'd examined her liver, I'd found evidence of acute toxic injury, damage that had occurred in the hours before her death. The toxicology screen had been revealing. Isabel had high levels of a cardiac glycoside in her system, a class of drugs that can cause fatal heart arrhythmias at toxic doses. The specific compound was oleandrin, a natural toxin found in the oleander plant, not a medication Isabel had any reason to be taking. Oleandrin poisoning can mimic a heart attack, causing the same cardiac symptoms while also damaging other organs. It's difficult to detect unless you're specifically looking for it, and it's been used historically as a poison because it's available from a common ornamental plant. I'd amended my autopsy findings to indicate that Isabel's death was due to oleandrin poisoning, probable homicide. I documented everything carefully and had submitted my report to the medical examiner's office and to the Boston Police Department. I'd also reached out to Gabriel to tell him what I'd found, and that's when he told me about Isabel's discovery of the falsified clinical trial data, about her plan to report Meridian Pharmaceuticals to the FDA and possibly to Congress, and about the threatening phone calls she'd received in the week before her death. Gabriel had given me access to Isabel's research files. She'd been meticulous, documenting every discrepancy she'd found, building a comprehensive case that Meridian had knowingly released drugs that were more dangerous than their FDA approval documents indicated. She'd identified 11 different medications that had been approved based on falsified data. She'd calculated that these drugs were likely responsible for thousands of unreported deaths and tens of thousands of serious adverse events that the medical community had attributed to other causes because the published safety profiles didn't reflect the real risks. Isabel had contacted the FDA's Office of Drug Safety on December 18th, requesting a confidential meeting to discuss her findings. She'd also reached out to a congressional staffer she'd known from graduate school, someone who worked for a senator on the health committee. She'd told Gabriel that she was going to spend Christmas going through her documentation one more time, making sure everything was airtight, and then she was going to formally submit her findings after the holidays. She'd said she understood this would probably end her career, that pharmaceutical companies had enormous power and would retaliate, but that people were dying from drugs that should never have been approved. I'd presented all of this to the Boston Police Homicide Division, expecting a thorough investigation. Instead, I'd been met with skepticism. The detective assigned to the case, a veteran investigator named William Fletcher, had questioned whether I was letting my personal relationship with Isabel cloud my professional judgment. He'd suggested that perhaps Isabel had taken the oleandrin herself, that perhaps the stress of what she'd discovered had pushed her to suicide. The investigation had stalled. No arrests were made, no suspects were identified. The case had been classified as suspicious death, possible suicide, and had been effectively closed. I'd continued pushing, filing complaints with the medical examiner's office, reaching out to journalists, trying to get someone to take Isabel's death and her research findings seriously. And then Meridian Pharmaceuticals had filed a lawsuit against me. The lawsuit, filed in February 2013, had accused me of defamation and professional misconduct. Meridian claimed that I'd made false and damaging accusations about their clinical trial practices based on manipulated evidence, that Isabel had been suffering from mental health issues that had distorted her judgment, and that my statements about her death had caused significant harm to their business reputation. The suit had been accompanied by a formal complaint to the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine, alleging that I'd violated professional ethics by discussing a patient's autopsy findings publicly and by making claims that were not supported by the evidence. Fighting the lawsuit and the medical board complaint had consumed 2 years of my life and most of my savings. Despite my documentation, despite the clear evidence of oleandrin poisoning, I'd been portrayed as a conspiracy theorist who'd become obsessed with an unfounded vendetta against a reputable pharmaceutical company. Meridian had produced their own expert witnesses who'd testified that the oleandrin in Isabel's system could have come from herbal supplements she'd been taking, that the cardiac damage was consistent with natural disease, and that my interpretation of the toxicology was influenced by my bias. The lawsuit had been settled out of court in January 2015, with terms that included my agreement not to make any further public statements about Isabel's death or about Meridian's clinical trials. The medical board had suspended my license for 2 years for what they'd called conduct unbecoming of the profession, specifically my discussion of autopsy findings with the media. When my license had been reinstated in 2017, I'd found that my reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that no hospital or medical examiner's office would hire me. Isabel's research findings were never formally investigated. The FDA's Office of Drug Safety had acknowledged receiving her initial contact but stated that she'd never followed up with the promised documentation. The drugs she'd identified as having falsified safety data remain on the market, prescribed to millions of patients annually. Meridian Pharmaceuticals' stock price has tripled since 2012. No one has ever been charged in Isabel's death. I now work part-time as a medical consultant, reviewing cases for attorneys, barely earning enough to cover my basic expenses. I'm 61 years old, and I'll likely never practice forensic pathology again. But I've kept copies of everything, Isabel's research, my autopsy findings, the documentation of Meridian's legal intimidation. And I've continued tracking suspicious deaths of medical researchers, regulatory officials, and journalists who've investigated pharmaceutical industry corruption. Isabel's case is one of 34 similar deaths I've documented since 2008. People who discovered inconvenient truths about drug safety and who died under circumstances that were never properly investigated. If anyone has information about clinical trial data manipulation at Meridian Pharmaceuticals or other drug companies, if you're a researcher or medical professional who's witnessed similar practices, if you have knowledge about what happened to Isabel Cardozo, please contact the Public Citizens Health Research Group or the Project on Government Oversight. There are organizations that will protect whistleblowers and will investigate these cases properly. Isabel died trying to protect patients from dangerous drugs that never should have been approved. The least we can do is make sure her work wasn't in vain.